The water rushed through the broken dam gates like liquid vengeance, carrying with it years of frustration and stolen dreams. I stood on the hillside watching 35 perfect suburban homes disappear under the flood I had created. The HOA president who had stolen my land was screaming into her phone, knee-deep in muddy water, watching her empire of corruption wash away. 6 months earlier, I thought the worst thing that could happen was losing my job. I had no idea that while I was gone, a criminal organization disguised as a homeowners association would steal my family's century-old property and build an entire neighborhood where my grandfather's pastures used to be. But they made one critical mistake. They never checked who controlled the water rights. That morning, as I watched their perfect little world flood, I realized something important. Sometimes justice does not come from lawyers or judges. Sometimes it comes from opening a dam and letting nature reclaim what was always hers. After 18 months away caring for my dying father in Oregon, I finally drove back to the small Texas town where I was born. The two-lane highway looked the same, but something felt different as I approached the turnoff to my property. New street signs pointed toward something called Willow Creek Estates. I had never heard that name before. My confusion turned to disbelief as I rounded the familiar bend where my driveway should have been. Instead of the old gravel road leading to my modest farmhouse, I found myself staring at a massive stone entrance with bronze lettering that read Willow Creek Estates, a planned community. Beyond the gates, rows of identical beige houses stretched across what used to be my family's 40-acre spread. I pulled over and stepped out of my truck, my legs shaking. The rolling pasture where my grandfather raised cattle was gone. The old oak grove where I built tree forts as a child had been replaced by a playground with bright plastic equipment. Even the small creek that gave our property its name had been channeled into decorative concrete culverts. A man in a golf cart approached me, wearing a polo shirt with the HOA logo embroidered on the chest. "Sir, this is a private community. Do you have business here?" "This is my land," I said, my voice barely working. "I own this property." He laughed. "That is impossible. This development has been here for over a year. You need to leave before I call security." I fumbled for my phone and pulled up the deed documents I kept stored in my email. "Look at this. My name is on the county records. This is my family's land." The man glanced at my phone screen and his expression shifted to confusion, then concern. "You need to speak with Mrs. Henderson. She handles all the property disputes." 20 minutes later, I sat in a pristine community center facing Margaret Henderson, a woman in her 50s with perfectly styled hair and the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. She wore a business suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. "Mr. Patterson, I understand your confusion," she said in a voice dripping with fake sympathy. "But this land has been properly acquired through legal channels. Our development company purchased it from the county after the previous owner abandoned it." "I never abandoned anything," I said, struggling to keep my voice level. "I was taking care of my father. I paid my property taxes through automatic withdrawal." Mrs. Henderson slid a folder across the table. "Perhaps you should review these documents with a lawyer. As you can see, everything was done according to the law." I opened the folder and found page after page of legal paperwork, permits, and county approvals. Every document looked official, complete with stamps and signatures from people I had never heard of. But one thing was missing from every single page. "Where is my signature?" I asked. "How did you transfer my property without my consent?" Mrs. Henderson's fake smile faltered for just a moment. "Sir, I think there has been some kind of misunderstanding. This matter was settled long ago. If you continue to harass our residents, I will have no choice but to contact the authorities." I stood up slowly, my hands clenched into fists. "The authorities? Lady, I am going to contact every authority in this county. This is theft, plain and simple." "Security will escort you out," she said, pressing a button on her desk. "Do not return to this property without proper legal representation." As two security guards walked me back to my truck, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the distance, beyond the neat rows of stolen houses, I could see the old stone dam that my great-grandfather had built in 1923. The dam that controlled the flow of Willow Creek through the entire valley. The dam that still belonged to me. The next morning, I arrived at the county courthouse before it opened, clutching a box of family documents that proved my ownership going back 4 generations. The clerk, a tired-looking woman named Betty, pulled up my property records on her computer and frowned. "This is strange," she said, scrolling through pages of data. "Your deed is still active and current. Property taxes are paid through 2024, but there are also permits issued for the Willow Creek development on the same parcel number." "How is that possible?" I asked. Betty shook her head. "Someone made a serious mistake, or something worse than a mistake." I spent the next week visiting every lawyer in the county, and the story was always the same. The HOA had deep pockets and political connections. The legal fees to fight them would be astronomical, with no guarantee of success. Most lawyers would not even take the case. "Listen," said Robert Martinez, the fifth attorney I consulted. "I looked into this Willow Creek situation. 3 county commissioners have family members living in that development. The planning director who approved the permits. His daughter bought one of the houses. You are not just fighting an HOA, you are fighting a network of corruption that goes all the way to the top." "So what do I do?" I asked. Martinez leaned back in his chair. "Get a very expensive lawyer from Houston or Dallas, someone with no local connections. Plan to spend at least $200,000, and even then you might lose." I left his office feeling hopeless. $200,000 might as well have been $2 million. I had spent most of my savings caring for my father, and my job prospects were not great at 53 years old. That afternoon, I drove back to what used to be my property and parked outside the gates. I needed to see it again to understand the full scope of what had been stolen from me. The development was massive. 35 houses, each probably worth $300,000 or more. Streets, sidewalks, a community center, a swimming pool. Someone had invested serious money in this theft. As I sat in my truck, a young woman approached with a stroller. She looked nervous but determined. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you the man who says this used to be your land?" I nodded. 4 generations of my family lived here. "My name is Sarah Chen. My husband and I bought that house over there." She pointed to a pale yellow house with a small front yard. "We paid our life savings for it, $320,000. The pain in her voice was obvious. "We heard what happened, about the land ownership. We are scared we are going to lose everything." "You might," I said honestly. "I am sorry, I know you are victims too." Sarah started crying. "We have a baby. We thought we were buying the American dream. Instead, we might have bought stolen property." As she walked away, I realized the true evil of what the HOA had done. They had not just stolen from me. They had turned dozens of innocent families into unwitting accomplices in their crime. Even if I won in court, those families would lose their homes and their life savings. That evening, I walked along the old property lines, trying to remember what everything used to look like. The creek still flowed through concrete channels, but it followed the same path it had for centuries. I followed it upstream until I reached the stone dam that my great-grandfather had built to create the pond where we used to fish. The dam was exactly as I remembered it. Solid limestone blocks, fitted together with the kind of craftsmanship that does not exist anymore. A small metal plaque near the control wheel read, "Patterson Family Water Rights Established 1923 County Record 847. I pulled out my phone and took pictures of the plaque, then researched water rights law until 2 in the morning. What I found changed everything. Water rights in Texas are some of the strongest property rights that exist. They date back to Spanish colonial law and have been upheld by every court for over 2 centuries. More importantly, water rights cannot be transferred without the explicit consent of the owner. Ever. The HOA might have stolen my land through corruption and forged documents, but they could never steal the water that flowed through it. The dam, the creek, and everything downstream still belonged to me. And I was about to remind them what that meant. I spent the next 2 weeks in the public library and courthouse, digging through every record I could find about Margaret Henderson and Willow Creek estates. What I discovered made me sick to my stomach. This was not Henderson's first time stealing land. Over the past 10 years, her company had used similar tactics in 3 other counties. The pattern was always the same. Find rural property with elderly or absent owners. Use connections in local government to declare the land abandoned. Rush through permits and approvals before anyone notices. Build expensive houses and sell them to unsuspecting families. In every case, the original landowners had been forced to accept small settlements rather than fight expensive legal battles. The families who bought the houses never learned they were living on stolen land. Henderson walked away with millions while leaving a trail of victims behind her. But I also discovered something Henderson did not know. The Patterson family water rights were not just historical curiosities. They were active, legally protected, and absolutely inviolate under state law. My great-grandfather had been smart enough to register the water rights separately from the land deed. Even if someone could steal the property through fraud, they could never touch the water. The dam, the creek flow, and the downstream watershed all remained under Patterson family control. I found the original engineering survey from 1923 and compared it to modern county flood maps. The results were shocking. Willow Creek estates had been built directly in the natural flood plain of the creek. Without the dam holding back water upstream, the entire development would be underwater during heavy rains. The county planning office should have caught this obvious violation. Floodplain construction requires special permits, elevated foundations, and flood insurance disclosures. None of those requirements had been followed. I dug deeper and found the smoking gun. The floodplain maps used for the development permits were not the current, accurate maps from the National Weather Service. They were outdated maps from 1987, before modern climate data was available. Someone had deliberately used old, inaccurate information to hide the flood risk. Then I found the phone number for Jennifer Walsh, a hydraulic engineer who had worked on water management projects throughout East Texas. When I explained the situation, she agreed to meet me at the dam. "This is definitely a functional flood control structure," she said, after examining the limestone walls and metal gates. "Your family has been maintaining it for 100 years. "Every spring and fall," I said. "My father taught me how to operate the gates when I was 12. Jennifer studied the control mechanisms and the downstream flow patterns. "If you opened these gates during the rainy season, how much water would flow downstream?" "Depends on the rainfall," I said. In a normal year, maybe 3 or 4 feet of depth in the creek bed. During heavy rains, it could be 6 or 8 feet. She pulled out her tablet and showed me a topographical map of the area. According to this survey, the houses in that development are built at an elevation of 412 feet. The normal creek bed is at 408 feet. So the houses are only 4 feet above the water level. That is correct. And look at this. She pointed to elevation markers throughout the development. The first floors of those houses are maybe 18 inches above the surrounding ground level. If this creek ever returned to its natural flow pattern, those houses would flood. Jennifer looked at me seriously. You understand what this means, right? You have absolute legal authority to manage the water flow on your property. You could restore the creek to its natural state anytime you want. That night, I sat in my truck outside the development gates, watching the perfect suburban lights twinkle in houses built on my stolen land. Families were having dinner, children were doing homework, couples were watching television. Normal people living normal lives in houses that should never have been built. But beneath their feet, Willow Creek was waiting, patient and eternal, held back only by stones laid by my great-grandfather's hands. Henderson had stolen my land. She had corrupted government officials. She had destroyed my family's century-old legacy. And she had done it all with such arrogance that she never bothered to check who controlled the water flowing underneath her crime. The monthly HOA meeting was held in the community center that used to sit where my grandfather's barn had stood. I arrived early and took a seat in the back row, carrying a manila folder thick with legal documents and historical records. Margaret Henderson called the meeting to order with her usual imperious manner. She wore another expensive suit and addressed the 30 or so residents like a queen speaking to peasants. Before we discuss this month's landscaping initiatives, she said, I want to address some wild rumors that have been circulating. A disturbed individual has been spreading lies about our community's legal foundation. I want everyone to know that Willow Creek Estates was developed through proper legal channels with full county approval. I stood up slowly. Mrs. Henderson, I would like to address that issue. The room fell silent. Henderson's face flushed red when she saw me. Sir, you are not a resident of this community. You have no right to speak at this meeting. Actually, I do, I said, walking toward the front of the room. Because every square inch of this community was built on my family's land without our permission or knowledge. Murmurs rippled through the audience. I could see Sarah Chen in the third row, holding her husband's hand tightly. That is absolutely false, Henderson snapped. Security, remove this man immediately. Wait, I said, opening my folder. Let me show everyone what Mrs. Henderson does not want you to see. I held up the original Patterson family deed, signed in 1891 and recorded in the county courthouse. This document proves my family has owned this land for over 130 years. It has never been sold, transferred, or abandoned. Next, I showed them the tax records proving continuous payment through automatic withdrawal, even during my absence. Then, I displayed the engineering survey showing that the entire development sat in a protected flood plain. Mrs. Henderson, I said, turning to face her directly, how did you obtain permits to build in a flood plain without proper environmental impact studies? Henderson's composure cracked. You are harassing residents with conspiracy theories and fraudulent documents. I am calling the police. Please do, I said. Ask them to bring someone from the district attorney's office. I think they will be very interested in how you forged transfer documents for property that was never for sale. A man in the front row stood up. Wait a minute. Are you saying our houses were built illegally? I am saying your houses were built on stolen land, I replied. Mrs. Henderson's company used fraudulent documents to claim ownership of property that belongs to my family. The room erupted in angry voices. Residents demanded answers from Henderson, who looked increasingly desperate. "This is ridiculous," she shouted over the noise. "Our legal team will destroy you in court. You have no standing, no proof, and no money to fight us." "You are right about one thing," I said calmly. "I cannot afford to fight you in court, but I do not need to." Henderson looked confused. "What do you mean?" I pulled out the final document from my folder. The 1923 water rights registration that gave my family absolute control over Willow Creek and its tributaries. While you were busy stealing my land, you forgot to check who owns the water flowing underneath it. My family has held water rights to this creek for over 100 years. Those rights can never be transferred without our explicit consent. "So what?" Henderson said, but her voice was shaking now. "So this entire development was built in the natural flood plain of Willow Creek. The only thing keeping your houses from flooding is an old stone dam that my great-grandfather built, a dam that I control." The room fell completely silent. Sarah Chen had gone pale. Her husband was staring at me with a mixture of fear and understanding. "You are threatening us," Henderson said. "I am informing you," I replied. "Every family in this room bought their home believing it was legally constructed on properly zoned land. You lied to them. You sold them houses built on stolen property in a flood zone. When the truth comes out, their mortgages will be invalid, their insurance will be canceled, and their life savings will be gone." I looked around the room at the frightened faces of people who had trusted Henderson with their futures. "Unless, of course, we can reach some kind of agreement that makes this right." Henderson was breathing hard, her face red with rage and panic. "Get out. Get out of here right now, or I will have you arrested." "For what? Standing on my own land?" She grabbed her phone and started dialing frantically. "We will see about that." I walked toward the exit, then turned back to address the room one final time. "Mrs. Henderson has 30 days to return my property and compensate everyone she has defrauded. After that, I will exercise my water rights according to the law." As I left the community center, I could hear Henderson screaming into her phone, demanding that someone arrest me for trespassing on property that had belonged to my family since before she was born. Henderson's response came faster than I expected. 3 days after the HOA meeting, I found a lawsuit taped to the door of the motel room where I was staying. She was suing me for harassment, trespassing, and making terroristic threats against the community. The local newspaper ran a story painting me as a disturbed drifter trying to extort money from hardworking families. The county sheriff paid me a visit to warn me about causing trouble in their peaceful community. Even the manager of the motel asked me to find somewhere else to stay. But Henderson's aggressive response told me everything I needed to know. She was scared, and scared people make mistakes. I drove to Austin and spent 2 days in the state law library, researching everything I could find about water rights, dam operations, and environmental restoration. What I learned changed my perspective completely. Under Texas water law, I had not just the right but the legal obligation to maintain the natural flow of Willow Creek. The dam was a flood control structure, not a permanent lake. During the rainy season, standard water management practices required releasing excess water to prevent erosion and maintain downstream ecosystem health. I also discovered that Willow Creek was designated as habitat for several protected species, including the Guadalupe bass, and the fountain darter. The artificial pond created by the dam had disrupted the natural spawning patterns of these fish for decades. When I contacted Dr. Maria Santos at the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, she was immediately interested in my situation. "We have been looking for opportunities to restore natural creek flows in East Texas," she said during our phone conversation. "The Willow Creek watershed is particularly important because it connects to the Colorado River system." "What would happen if the dam was opened and the creek returned to its natural flow?" I asked. "It would recreate the original wetland habitat that existed before development. The temporary flooding would restore soil composition and allow native plants to reestablish themselves. From an environmental perspective, it would be extremely beneficial, even if there are houses in the floodplain." Dr. Santos paused. "Houses should never have been built in that flood plain in the first place. If they were, it represents a serious violation of environmental protection laws." I hung up the phone with a clear sense of purpose. This was not about revenge anymore. It was about restoring the natural environment that Henderson had destroyed when she paved over my family's land. I drove back to the dam and spent hours studying the control mechanisms my father had taught me to operate. The main gates were simple but effective. A large wheel turned a gear system that lifted heavy metal panels, allowing water to flow through openings in the stone wall. During normal conditions, we kept the gates partially open to maintain steady creek flow downstream. During dry seasons, we closed them completely to preserve water in the pond. During heavy rains, we opened them fully to prevent the dam from overflowing and washing out. Jennifer Walsh had explained that opening the gates during the current rainy season would restore the creek to approximately its natural flow level. The water would spread across the original flood plain, creating temporary wetlands that would drain naturally over several days. The houses in Willow Creek estates would experience flooding, but not the catastrophic kind that destroys foundations or threatens lives. More like the kind that makes basements uninhabitable and ruins hardwood floors. Expensive and disruptive, but not deadly. I spent a week monitoring weather patterns and rainfall predictions. The National Weather Service was forecasting heavy spring rains starting the following Monday. Perfect conditions for what environmental engineers call controlled flood management. On Sunday evening, I wrote a detailed letter explaining my actions and mailed copies to the district attorney, the state environmental agency, and the local newspaper. I wanted there to be no question about my legal authority and environmental justification for what I was about to do. The letter explained the century-old water rights, the illegal construction in the floodplain, and the environmental benefits of restoring natural creek flow. I included documentation from Dr. Santos supporting the ecological restoration, along with historical records proving the Patterson family's legal ownership of the water. I also wrote a separate letter to Sarah Chen and the other families living in the development. I apologized for what they were about to experience and promised to help them seek compensation from Henderson and the county officials who had enabled the fraud. As I sealed the envelopes, I thought about my great-grandfather building the dam with his own hands, stone by stone. He had created it to manage the natural flow of water across Patterson land. Now it was time to let that water flow again. I woke up at 4 in the morning to the sound of heavy rain drumming against my motel room window. The weather forecast had been accurate. The spring storm system was moving through right on schedule, bringing the kind of sustained rainfall that would fill the pond behind the dam to capacity. I drove through the darkness to the old access road that led to the dam. The limestone structure looked exactly as it had when my father first taught me to operate the gates 30 years ago. Solid, permanent, built to last for centuries. The pond was already higher than I had seen it in years. Runoff from the hills upstream had been collecting behind the dam for 3 days, creating exactly the conditions needed for natural flood management. I checked my phone one last time. 5:17 in the morning. The houses in Willow Creek Estates would be dark and quiet, families sleeping peacefully in homes that should never have been built. My hands were shaking as I gripped the control wheel. This was the point of no return. Once I opened those gates, there would be no way to undo what happened next. I thought about my grandfather teaching my father to fish in the pond behind this dam. I thought about my father teaching me to swim in the same water. 4 generations of Patterson men had maintained this structure and managed this water flow. Margaret Henderson had stolen our land, but she could never steal our water rights. It was time to remind her of that fact. I turned the wheel slowly at first, opening the gates just enough to increase the normal creek flow. Water began rushing through the stone channels, creating a deeper, faster current than the development residents had ever seen. Then I kept turning. The gates opened wider, releasing decades of accumulated rainfall back into the natural creek bed where it belonged. The sound of rushing water grew louder, echoing off the stone walls of the dam like thunder. I climbed to the top of the dam structure and watched the water spread across the valley below. In the gray pre-dawn light, I could see Willow Creek returning to its original boundaries. Water flowed around and between the houses, reclaiming the flood plain that had been its home for thousands of years. The first residents began waking up around 6:30. I watched lights come on in houses as people discovered water in their garages and basements. By 7 o'clock, the community was in full panic mode. From my position on the dam, I could see people wading through knee-deep water, carrying belongings to higher ground. Cars tried to navigate flooded streets, creating waves that lapped against front porches. The community center where Henderson had dismissed me as a liar was now surrounded by Brown Creek water. My phone started ringing. Local news stations, emergency services, county officials. I let most of the calls go to voicemail, but I answered when I saw Dr. Santos calling from Parks and Wildlife. "Mr. Patterson, we are getting reports of flooding in the Willow Creek area. Is this related to your dam operation?" "Yes, ma'am," I said. "I opened the gates this morning to restore natural creek flow during the rainy season. Everything I am doing is within my legal rights as the water rights holder." "Are people in danger?" I looked down at the development where residents were moving through waist-deep water, but clearly not drowning or in immediate peril. "No, ma'am. This is temporary flood plain restoration, not a catastrophic flood. The water will recede naturally over the next few days as the rain stops." Emergency vehicles began arriving around 8 o'clock. Fire trucks, ambulances, even a helicopter from the county rescue service. But as they quickly discovered, this was not a disaster requiring rescue operations. It was simply a creek returning to its natural state. Margaret Henderson arrived in a white SUV, accompanied by 2 men in expensive suits who were probably her lawyers. I watched her wade through the muddy water in her business pumps, screaming at anyone who would listen. Even from a distance, I could see her pointing up at the dam where I stood. She was demanding that someone arrest me, force me to close the gates, restore her perfect suburban paradise. But there was nothing anyone could do. The water rights were mine. The dam was on my property. The environmental restoration was legally justified and ecologically beneficial. By noon, news trucks had arrived from Houston and Dallas. Reporters interviewed wet, angry residents standing in front of their flooded houses. They interviewed Henderson, who called me a terrorist and demanded immediate government action. But they also interviewed Dr. Santos, who explained the environmental benefits of restoring natural creek flow. They interviewed Jennifer Walsh, who confirmed that the houses had been illegally built in a protected flood plain. As the afternoon wore on, the real story began to emerge. This was not a crazy man destroying a community out of spite. This was a landowner exercising his legal rights to restore natural water flow across property that had been stolen through corruption and fraud. The water kept flowing, and I kept watching. The flood receded slowly over 4 days, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Where Margaret Henderson had built her perfect suburban development, nature had reclaimed the original wetlands that existed before the theft of Patterson land. The houses were still standing, but they were uninhabitable. Mud and debris filled the ground floors. Electrical systems were ruined. Hardwood floors were warped beyond repair. The community center where Henderson had dismissed me as a liar was a brown, stinking shell. More importantly, the environmental investigation triggered by the flooding revealed the full scope of the corruption behind Willow Creek Estates. Federal agents found evidence that Henderson had bribed county officials, forged property transfer documents, and violated dozens of environmental protection laws. The county planning director who approved the permits was arrested. 3 commissioners who accepted money to fast-track the development were indicted. Henderson herself faced charges for fraud, bribery, and racketeering. The families who bought houses in the development were declared victims of fraud. Their mortgages were invalidated, and a victim compensation fund was established using assets seized from Henderson's company. Most of them received enough money to buy legitimate homes in legal neighborhoods. Sarah Chen stopped by the dam one afternoon while I was checking the water levels. She was holding her baby and looked tired but hopeful. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "I know what you did destroyed our house, but it also saved us from living a lie. We got our money back, and we bought a place in town that was never built on stolen land." "I am sorry you had to go through that," I said. "Do not be sorry, you exposed the truth. That matters more than anything." The State Environmental Agency officially designated the restored Willow Creek wetlands as protected habitat. The temporary flooding had allowed native plants to reestablish themselves and created spawning grounds for protected fish species. I hired contractors to remove the concrete channels and artificial landscaping that Henderson had installed. Within 6 months, the creek looked much like it had when my grandfather was a boy. The Patterson family water rights were permanently secured through a legal precedent that prevented future attempts to steal property with active water management systems. Other rural landowners used my case to protect their own property from similar fraud schemes. I built a small cabin near the dam, close to where my grandfather's farmhouse used to stand. On quiet evenings, I sit by the creek and listen to the water flowing freely through the restored wetlands. Margaret Henderson was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for fraud and corruption. Her company was dissolved, and its assets were used to compensate victims across multiple counties. The local newspaper that had called me a disturbed drifter published a front-page apology and a series of articles about rural land theft and government corruption. The county sheriff who had warned me about causing trouble was voted out of office. Sometimes justice comes from courtrooms and lawyers. Sometimes it comes from opening a dam and letting a creek remember where it used to flow. The water knows the truth, and the water always wins.